Recently, I've been thinking about a lot of different stuff people don't know about Overwatch, which this has been in my mind a lot, just seeing the way people talk about Overwatch. Because whenever I see people talk about this game, they mostly talk about MOBAs, which I think is really strange. Because if you look at Overwatch's history, it is barely based on MOBAs. But what it is based on a lot is actually a bunch of old school shooter games. And a bunch of the heroes have some direct weapon inspirations. So I thought, if no one else has done this yet, I might as well be the one to do it. So let me highlight to you a bunch of really cool old games that Overwatch is taking a bunch of inspiration from when it comes to the weapons. And of course, there's only one place we can truly begin. Once upon a time, there was nothing, but then there was Doom. In reality, this began with Wolfenstein, but everyone cares about Doom. Doom is a revolutionary great game that was the start of the type of game most would see as the modern first-person shooter. Because of how much Doom set the standard for these games, most shooter games at the time were genuinely known as Doom clones. And Doom's arsenal of weapons is arguably the type of weapons you see in most shooter games nowadays. And then, after Doom set these ground rules, we get to id Software's next game, which was the 3D shooter game, Quake, which is kinda just Doom in a third dimension, but that didn't really stop people from liking it. And here in Quake is actually where I want to begin. Obviously Quake had all the same weapons as Doom, but it also had another important weapon that could be used because of the third dimension, which was the grenade launcher. And now you're probably thinking, oh yeah, this is Junkrat, but Junkrat isn't based on Quake, he is based on the demo man from Team Fortress, right? Which, you aren't technically wrong, but you also need to know the origin of Demo Man's grenade launcher, which goes back to Quake, since Team Fortress was a Quake mod. Even arguably, because Junkrat's grenade launcher is able to bounce once and then still direct hit the enemy, it is actually the more accurate grenade launcher to Quake, since Quake's grenade launcher allowed for the same function, which to me, in practice, is so cool. It really shows how strong the concept for this weapon was, because it just slotted so well into Overwatch. And another hero I think is really hard to not mention here, who probably also has some Quake inspiration, is Orisa, which you might think, why is that? Well, just look at the function of Quake's Super Nail Gun, which is a chain gun that shoots small projectiles, similar to Orisa, which I for one think is super cool. But that was just Quake 1. To get to a game where the visuals match even better, we gotta get to the second Quake game, which is Quake 2. And here in Quake 2, we actually got more direct examples of inspiration visually. Sojourn, to me, is a very easy example of a hero that was inspired by this game. Because Quake 2 is the game with the railgun, and Sojourn, she's the hero with the railgun. Her entire identity is, she has a railgun. And would you look at that? The VFX for the railgun in Quake 2 and the VFX for Sojourn are so similar. Even on the functional side, they're similar, with both Sojourn and the Quake 2 railgun piercing enemies, so you're effectively able to hit multiple enemies at once, which is really cool they got this into Sojourn's kit. And it's also interesting to me that it's such a direct inspiration for this hero. And then our second Quake 2 hero is Pharah, who I think it's really fun that if you look at her rocket launcher, and then you look at the Quake 2 rocket launcher, the way the two fire the rockets is so similar. And then of course the way the rocket launcher is built is so similar. And obviously also how it functions, which to me is so cool to see that this rocket launcher is such a direct inspiration for Pharah's weapon. And it is so cool that it was so important for them to have specifically this type of rocket launcher in Overwatch, compared to the more classic type of rocket launcher you expect from other games. With obviously the big example being the rocket launcher from Team Fortress, which obviously people often compare to TF2 characters and Overwatch characters, But it's so interesting to me that like TF2 is so inspired by Quake 1 because it was a mod of that. While Overwatch as an original game was inspired more by Quake 2 in this scenario. But that's obviously not to say that Overwatch doesn't take anything from Team Fortress, because it very much does. Which I can barely think of a better example than Torbjorn, with not his gun, but his turret. Which, the turret technically comes from Team Fortress Classic, but as you can see when we compare them to Torbjorn's turret, the shapes are completely different, and the functionality is different. Where if we do the same shape comparison with the TF2 turret, you can see there's a lot more overlap in the way the turret is shaped when it upgrades. With the clearest example being both level 3 turrets, which gets this chamber at the top to store turrets to shoot at people. And actually, a fun fact about Torbjorn is that he did actually used to have a metal mechanic in the early versions of Overwatch, but this was scrapped before launch. Because from what I understand, it was kinda weird to have to collect this resource to then get a better turret. But you only got this resource from enemies and teammates dying. And another easy Team Fortress comparison is Mercy. I'm just gonna say this straight up. Mercy's beam wouldn't exist without the medic's medigun. Because Team Fortress just figured out such an easy solution to helping your teammates, which is just place a beam on them and it heals them. Though Mercy is missing the very iconic overheal mechanic that the medic has, and the Uber charges in some way. Because Mercy has damage boost, she still kinda has a Uber charge style effect, but it's less extreme compared to what an Uber charge would be. And arguably the Uber charge in Team Fortress has the power level of kind of like an ultimate, you could say. But obviously it's hard to directly compare since Medic is the only character with this type of mechanic in the game. Also, in case you're wondering why I didn't talk about Team Fortress Classic, it is because the Medic used to heal like this in that game. Which, to say the least, there's a reason they had to come up with the Medigun for the Medic to feel good to play. But talking about Team Fortress Classic is the perfect excuse to get to our next game, which is on the same engine. The Gold Source engine, or as most probably think of it as, the Half-Life engine. But what could be so interesting about talking about Half-Life? Well, we have a perfect hero, and we have a direct source that this was the inspiration for this hero. It is Cassidy and his revolver. And arguably, from the Half-Life series, the revolver is one of the most iconic weapons from Half-Life 1 and the Half-Life 2 trilogy. It is either a hardcore one-shot machine or two-shot machine on most enemies, which really gives it this oomph that some of the other weapons don't have. Again, as I'm probably repeating, I think there's something so fun that Overwatch is able to take this weapon from a different game and then they make an entire hero's kit around this weapon, which just shows how simple the inspiration for a hero can be. But obviously, it's kinda hard for me to ignore the fact that Cassidy also has a lot of inspiration from other stuff, like his Deadeye Ultimate, which is directly inspired by this mechanic from the Red Dead games. And this mechanic also has the name Deadeye, just in case people might be able to miss what this ultimate was inspired by. But we don't just have Cassidy to talk about here. Freya's another hero who seemingly also got inspired by Half-Life, which makes a lot of sense if you notice how old the concept for her kit was, which seems to have been in the works in some form since Overwatch had its first hero lineup during the Project Prometheus era, which here you see a lady who has a crossbow and a similar cape to Freya, which makes it easy to assume that, oh yeah, this hero became Freya. Also, as a quick fun thingy, in Half-Life, the crossbow is technically a tranquilizer, but if you play deathmatch, the crossbow shoots explosive arrows, kinda like what Freya does. But that's enough Half-Life. Let's get to a different game. This one you might not see coming, but Sombra's Translocators likely based on the weapon of the same name from Unreal Tournament, which overall had a similar use to this iconic ability, And obviously it's a very simple concept, but it's also a really neat concept. This idea of throwing out a projectile and then teleporting to it. It's easy to see why they would take an ability like this and put it into Overwatch. And a fun fact about the translocator from Unreal is that it was only used in the CTF game modes. And if you're curious about the footage I have, I actually didn't know where to find and download Unreal, so I just downloaded a mod pack in Gmod to get the Unreal weapons. Halo was a series I was really scared I wouldn't get to talk about, but thankfully mid-working on this video, Overwatch announced perks! And would you look at that? Life Weaver has a perk that deals burst damage to an enemy if you hit a bunch of shots on them. Similar to arguably one of the most iconic Halo weapons, the Needler, which again, I just think it helps highlight how many different places they take ideas from, because at least on my research, this is about it when it comes to weapons inspired by Halo. But also, I would love to be wrong about this fact. Or as I should maybe say, I would love to be wrong about this fact in the future. Also, this is a side note because I haven't been able to verify this, but I think quick melees might come from Halo, but I still need to double check on that fact. And now we can get to the last one, which I've been very excited for, because there's a bit of history with this one. Our final hero we got to talk about is D.Va, and she's arguably the hero I got the least direct connection with, and that is why I need to explain the period that she was made in. Months before Overwatch was even announced in November 2014, the first Titanfall game had come out. So putting 2 and 2 together, we can see that D.Va exists because the team thought that, yeah, a hero that uses a mech is sick, and then allowing them to be in a pilot mode makes it even cooler. Even though that, in comparison, D.Va's pilot mode is kinda lame compared to Titanfall. But it's a thought that counts. Before I go into the overlap with some of the abilities that the Titans have, and D.Va's mech have, I want to look at the concept art for D.Va. And as you can see, the mech used to have a singular eye up here, similar to what the Titans have, which is just so interesting to see that, oh yeah, it was probably this direct that they got inspired by this game. Which can even get into other stuff like defense matrix. In Titanfall, other Titans have the ability to either eat projectiles or capture projectiles to shoot back, which is very similar to the role defense matrix have of allowing D.Va to just eat projectiles so people don't get hit. And obviously, something the Titans have is self-destruct, which is obviously a very iconic part of D.Va's kit now, because it's her ultimate. And obviously, technically, her pilot ultimate got inspired by the Titanfall ability, which summons your Titan. But obviously, in Titanfall, your Titan is more independent compared to D.Va's mech, which is a state change rather than a different character on the map. And that's all the heroes and games I want to talk about in this video. Working on this has been really interesting, because it's really fun to look at how Overwatch was inspired by so many games, because you rarely see it talked about, as I mentioned earlier. And I hope watching this inspires you to do some of your own research to find out what did inspire Overwatch, and how did Overwatch help make all these different game mechanics click in their own game. Because it's rare you see a game this successfully make so many different playstyles exist, which to me has always been so impressive, and such a big reason why Overwatch is such a cool game, since it arguably did something new by taking a bunch of old stuff and recontextualizing it into its own thing. But anyway, that's it for me for now. And remember, inspiration can come from anywhere, but in this case, inspiration came from old-ass shooter games.